Welcome to the Middlesex Moments radio show. I'm Dr. Anna Wasesha, president of Middlesex Community College, and joining me today is Victor Triay, who is a professor of history at Middlesex, and he's also a prolific writer. And today what we're going to be talking about is his newest novel, which is the second in a series of indeterminate length. And we talked about the first one.
That's
and
right.
So now we can start anywhere. I just want you to introduce our listening audience to this. Maybe you need to start with the larger embrace of the whole series, and then we'll talk about book two.
Right. Well, a lot of my nonfiction research in the books I've published, a lot of it's focused on the early 1960s in Cuba, Cuban exiles. My first book was about Operation Pedro Pan, which brought over 14,000 unaccompanied Cuban refugee children to the United States, many of whom I know. This is the world that I'm from. People that have gone through these experiences. I was born in 1966, long after this, but I was brought up, in South Florida, Cuban American, so this was always all around me. And then I wrote another book on the Bay of Pigs invasion. And again, my whole life I've known Bay of Pigs veterans, the ones who fought, who invaded Cuba and were later abandoned. So, I mean, those were always things in my growing up that you'd always heard about. More about the Bay of Pigs, because Pedro Pan, you always heard about the kids who came from Cuba alone, but that was about it. And then your imagination just kind of filled in the rest. And even for a lot of them who came, they weren't necessarily aware that they were part of this big effort. It wasn't until, I would say, like the 90s, that a lot of people became aware that they were part of this big program. And that's when I wrote my first book. And there hadn't been a book written on that yet when I wrote it. And then, of course, with the Bay of Pigs. But in the back of my mind, I always had historical fiction in mind. And so I took everything I learned and everything I knew, and not to mention having to learn a lot of new things. And fortunately, I could pick up a telephone and call 1,000 people, including my father. Hey, tell me this, tell me that, tell me the other. So there's a lot of detail. I finally did what I'd wanted to do for years, and I wrote this historical fiction, which fortunately the people who lived through the era and the type of people that I'm writing about so far have all loved it. And so I'm like, well, thank goodness, that means I got the history right. And it's been a lot of fun. It's been a lot of fun. Book one, as you know, it follows a family, and I tried to make the family almost retrofit different social classes. They were former aristocrats, and so they have that view. They fall into that category. They were known in that part, but who had lost their fortune and now live more of a middle-class life. I have, the family owns a small family bank, which I also did because my grandfather was a lawyer, and he had a lot of small family banks as clients. And my father worked for my grandfather, and so I was able to get a lot of information there. And of course, the main character is a teacher. But again, he's not a typical teacher. I mean, he's a teacher who's a member of this family, so he probably lives a little bit better than most teachers and is in certain social circles. So, one of the challenges was, taking scenes, taking people, situations, and trying to fit them to different realities. Even during book two, there were certain battles, and they're part of a certain unit, and I had to put them certain places, certain ways, so that the reader could see the different things that happen. And I guess that was the biggest challenge of all. It was fun. It was a fun challenge, so book two is out.
And what's the name of it?
Freedom Betrayed. Book one is called The Struggle Begins, which covers this family through the period where a lot of people were involved in clandestine activities against the government, which is very typical in Cuba. It didn't only happen against Castro, right? But a lot of people did get involved who would have never gotten involved in politics before, including the members of this family. And I know plenty of those people who never had any activist experience who all of a sudden threw themselves in. And then a lot of the people who were in the invasion later had started out that way. Right, started out in Cuba conspiring, and then had to flee because they were in trouble. Came to Miami, joined the brigade, or not only Miami, some in New Orleans, some in New York, but mostly in Miami. And then went as part of this invasion force, which was the largest identifiable group in that invasion force were university students. And the vast majority of people who were in the brigade had no military experience at all, which also addresses certain myths that are out there, but we can talk about that
after
in a minute.
A break.
After our break.
We're going to take a break, and we'll be right back with Victor Triay and his book, Freedom. Well, welcome back to Middlesex Moments. I'm talking today with Victor Triay about his new book in the series, books fiction about Cuban Revolution and what ensued afterwards. And book two has just been released.
That's right.
And is available on
Amazon and Barnes & Noble and almost anywhere online. And again, the name of the series is The Unbroken Circle. That's the name of the overall series. Book one is called The Struggle Begins. Book two, Freedom Betrayed. and it's available now on multiple places online.
Including in a sort of e-reader version, right?
Yes, that's right. Well, it's on Kindle.
It's Kindle.
It's on Kindle specifically.
Great,
right.
great.
And even if you don't have a Kindle, there, on iPads, iPhones, etc.
You
you can get a Kindle app.
I know.
Right, so you don't have to have a Kindle to read on Kindle.
I know. I just realized that over the holidays.
Right.
So now I feel like I've advanced technologically.
That's right.
Okay, but let's go back to, this incredibly compelling story of the Cuban Revolution and then the individuals who got themselves together. So you have to tell us the history. Got themselves together and figured they're going to go back and try to take Cuba back from Castro.
Well, I think from day one, there were people, it wasn't untypical for Cubans, right, to, for there to be regime change somehow. A group of the politically active leave, go to Florida, raise money, go back and do something. That was a pattern that had existed. Castro did that. There's a house in Miami that Castro lived in. Castro was in Mexico. It was the way things kind of were done. Except now it was more serious because now we're talking about the Soviet Union and we're talking about the Cold War. This was no longer just Cubans fighting Cubans and Uncle Sam kind of hovering over it, seeing where this is all going to end up. This was something that nobody expected. I think most Cubans were shocked to find out they were in the middle of the Cold War. And all of a sudden Cuba became the center of the world. And so there were people who left. They started organizing. Of course, there were different groups. The political parties had groups. There were multiple. But finally, and a lot of the pro-democracy Cuban leaders who left, they were always bickering, etc. There's a lot of schism. And then finally, they came together with the encouragement of the U.S. government to say, listen, create a united political front. You can all keep fighting again later, but there has to be unity, and we'll fund that. And there were already groups training in the Everglades and other places, etc. And finally, this united democratic front, said, okay, we're going to create a liberation army. Now, mind you, there were people in Cuba fighting as well. There were guerrillas in the countryside. There were student activists. There was all sorts of things. But they said, we're going to create a liberation army.
Were they communicating between the Liberation Army and the people still in Cuba?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. This political front was made up of political leaders. And they all had their connections on the island of people who were doing this. Remember, there was no embargo. There was no travel ban at the time. This is all before all that set in. And so this front, with the help of the U.S. government, said, okay, we're going to form a liberation army. And there were already all sorts of people in Miami, young people. And so the first group they brought together was a group of former military cadets, all in their 20s, people who had no connections to the Batista regime. In fact, some of them had been imprisoned by Batista before. And the leader, San Roman, had served time under Batista, right, because he was conspiring against Batista. And so you had this group of former cadets, and that was one group. And then you had another group of university students, a lot of them members of the Catholic Student Union, right? But these were very active people. These were not, people carrying signs. This is a lot of direct action politics. They were sent to Yusepa Island off the west coast of Florida to be trained, in communication, sabotage, et cetera, et cetera. Then they sent one group to Panama, to the Panama Canal Zone, to do more military style, and then the other ones, mostly the students, communication, sabotage, et cetera. The idea being that they were going to go back to Cuba, infiltrate as guerrillas, because there was a anti-Castro guerrilla army at that time in the mountains, and that they were going to go in and support them and set up guerrilla groups elsewhere. There was an Air Force that was put together, made up of World War II B-26 bombers. They recruited exile pilots, some of whom had been in the Cuban Air Force before, some of whom were just in exile and had been airline pilots. And they said, well, we'll train you, and then you can airdrop supplies to the guerrillas, you can do C-46 transport planes, C-54s, and then they had a fleet of B-26s, which they sent a group of the Alabama Air National Guard, which is one of the few that still flew B-26s, to train them. But as time went by, toward the end of 1960, it was clear that a guerrilla infiltration was not going to work because Castro's counterintelligence was too good. It was being trained by the KGB. The airdrops were very difficult. And so they decided on a frontal invasion instead, right? They would invade Cuba. By this time, there were probably 400 or 500 people in this liberation army. They were recruiting in Miami, and it was slow because at that point, it was a lot of the individual political organizations, some of whom were part of that front, who were sending their people, and when they would get mad, they would hold up their people, to get concessions or whatever. And then finally, when they decided on a frontal assault, they said, we need a lot more people. People from the camps in Guatemala, because they set up the camps there, went to Miami, recruited, etc. And then probably around January, then you start to see kind of a surge in enlistments. And now we're talking mostly about a higher number of family men, people with families leaving their wives and kids, people who weren't necessarily political activists. And then they swelled the ranks to about 1,500 or so, or actually more. They trained there. The first plan was to invade Trinidad, which was a very anti-Castro city. It was right next to the Ecambray Mountains where the guerrillas were already operating. And the plan was to take Trinidad, had a sympathetic population to the invaders, take out the bridges leading to the cities with paratroopers. There were good beaches nearby for landing craft. There was a deep water port there for supply ships, which it wasn't just the supply ships that were going to leave Nicaragua later, but there were supply ships in port ready to go to resupply. And then basically, cut off the city, cut off the roads using the B-26s because Castro's Air Force was supposed to be destroyed before any of this happened, right? Destroy Castro's Air Force on the ground and basically create this perimeter around this city using the B-26s mostly, to stop any Castro forces from advancing on the city. And if Castro didn't have airplanes, it would have been very simple because the roads weren't that wide and there wasn't a whole lot of anything they could do. And of course, volunteers from the city, guerrilla fighters in the mountains next door, not to mention being able to bring more people in, and there were more people in training. When President Kennedy saw that plan, he kind of freaked out because
he was new to the presidency at that point.
He was new to the presidency. But you see, his mistake was, and this is in part thanks to one of his advisors, Goodwin, he really took up the Cuba cause during the campaign. And one of his criticisms of Nixon, because remember, Nixon was also Eisenhower's vice president, who was then president, criticizing, and of course, it's easy to run against a vice president because you can blame everything of the current administration on your opponent if he happens to be the vice president at the time. And one of Kennedy's biggest criticisms during the campaign was that the Eisenhower administration was doing nothing to help Cuban freedom fighters liberate their country. Of course, Nixon knew they were, right? Nixon knew full well that they were, but Nixon couldn't say so in the campaign. So Kennedy can hit the Eisenhower group hard and Nixon by criticizing that they haven't done anything. And of course, after Kennedy became president, he realized, oh, by the way, here's what we've been doing. And he got kind of nervous about that, and he didn't like it. And here's the plan. And it was a very sound plan. It went through several filters. This could work. And there were guerrillas all over Cuba. If they would have established a beachhead, it would have been completely different. And then starts, and one of the biggest myths, the greatest myth perhaps among many myths of the Bay of Pigs invasion, and you see it repeated over and over. And it's one of those things that if you repeat it enough times, it becomes truth, even though fundamentally it's not, is that Kennedy inherited this operation from the Eisenhower administration. Against his better judgment, he let it go, right? Well, what the plan that he inherited was radically different to what he ultimately approved, which was designed to his specifications, right? First of all, they changed the plan from Trinidad. He said there's too much noise, too many eyes. We want to hide the U.S. hand. He was very concerned about the United States hand not showing in all of this. And so they chose the Bay of Pigs. Same basic plan, take a beachhead, but here there were no sandy beaches. There was no port, meaning that they'd have to go back and forth from the ships. There was no town, no guerrillas nearby, no escape hatch, right? But it had an airfield, and all they had to do was, take the beachhead, and it was a 40-mile long beachhead, which they could easily do, take the airfield, and then have the B-26s land there, and then protect the 3 basically dirt roads that led to that beachhead. And it was still a good plan, right? But then I think President Kennedy's biggest problem was that he wanted to invade Cuba without invading Cuba, right? He wanted to make it appear that there was no invasion. And that's where they start getting into problems. The first change was let's separate the bombings, because the bombings were supposed to destroy Castro's Air Force on the ground, right? CIA, shots, and intelligence knew exactly where those planes were at any given moment. They're going to send the planes from Nicaragua, flown by Cubans in B-26s, to destroy them. I said, well, let's separate them. Let's make the first bombings 2 days before the invasion, because that way we can make it look like they were carried out by Cubans inside of Cuba. Right, and the CIA told him, well, that's not the best idea. It's better everything happen at once because you'll overwhelm them. All right, fine. You want to change it? We'll change it. They've already changed the site. And then they had a plan on D-2, April 15th, a large number of sorties in the morning, 16 airplanes in the morning at first light, 16 at last light. On D-1, April 16th, 16 in the morning, 16 at last light. And then the day of the invasion, an all-out strike on any Castro planes they didn't, and they were all designed to destroy Castro planes on the ground. Mm-hmm. And Castro only had a handful of planes by that time. I mean, he didn't have a whole Air Force. I mean, he had, maybe 10, 15 airplanes. I mean, that, and of World War II vintage. And of course, on D-Day, on midnight, or just into the 17th, the brigade was supposed to start landing, which was another mistake. In all of World War II, the United States Marines did one nighttime landing, and they never did it again, amphibious landing. Here, they're sending these guys to do an amphibious landing in the middle of nowhere. But anyway, that morning, the B-26s launch an all-out raid on Castro's airfields and then land at the Bay of Pigs at the airstrip, and then carried a whole new mission, which was to clog those roads of people coming in. That was the plan going in. Everything was fine on April 14th.
Oh, we'll take a break and we'll be right back. Well, we're back, and I'm Anna Wasesh, the president of Middlesex Community College, and I'm joined today by Victor Triay, who's just a remarkable professor of history and a storyteller. History is storytelling. I'm a large part of it anyway, and that's what makes it so interesting to everybody, I think. So you were telling the story. Of course,
Right.
You've written a novel, so that's why we're talking today, but the story, it transcends this particular novel. In fact, if we get a moment, I'd be very curious to hear how the Russians tell the story of the Bay of Pigs.
Okay.
If they were the ones advising Castro at the time.
Yeah.
But let's just go back into where we were.
Right.
which is-
We were at April 14th, and,
Yes.
and the next day the bombings were supposed to start. But President Kennedy's whole thing was not letting the U.S. hand show, and he became obsessed with that idea. And he kept asking, and he kept probing, and is there any way that we can make it look like those airplanes came from Cuba itself? It's like, no.
It's kind of a small place.
Well,
in the
right.
first
I mean,
place.
they had B-26 bombers,
Okay.
right? And so Kennedy figured, well, our fiction is going to be that the bombings were carried out by defecting Cuban pilots. That they defected, bombed their own airfields, and then what happened to them? Well, nobody really knows. And so he kept asking this and hoping that when the brigade landed, maybe the ships could just go, drop them off and leave, and it'll look like an internal uprising. There was a lot of focus on this idea of making it not look like an invasion, even though it was an invasion. See,
Let me just stop you for a moment. Is this before or after Khrushchev said that he would bury the U.S.?
Oh, I think this is before.
Way before.
Yeah, I think so. I'm almost sure it is.
But we have quite a lot of tension between the
of
Soviet
course.
Union and the U.S.
Absolutely. And that was one of the problems, is that now the Soviets were issuing statements. Everybody knew there was going to be an invasion. And the Soviets were issuing statements in solidarity, and Castro had already hugged Khrushchev in New York, et cetera, et cetera. So Kennedy, on the day before the invasion, asked Richard Bissell, right, from Connecticut, he was a Connecticut aristocrat who was now in charge of this operation. He was underneath Allen Dulles. And he says, well, can't we reduce the noise level? How many planes are going anyway? And he said 16. And he said, all right, reduce it. That's too many planes. This is for the April 15th D-2 bombing. What ended up happening, instead of having 16 sorties at first light and 16 sorties at last light, they ran 8 sorties at first light, and that was it. And they still got about half of Castro's Air Force. All right, but we still got the D-1 bombings, right, the next day. That afternoon, on the 15th, even though in the novel I put it all on the 14th just to make it neater, they cancel all the D-1. So the 32 sorties on D-1 are gone. So really what should have been, right, 64 sorties in the 2 days before the invasion were reduced to 8 48 hours before the invasion. And that was it. But don't worry. Again, there was always a thing, don't worry, because A, we still have the all-out bombing on D-Day, right, to take care of whatever's there. And there was so much insinuation, and in some cases, outright telling people that the U.S. is going in with you, right? There was U.S. aircraft carriers right offshore, the Essex carrying, fighter planes, right? And the whole thing was, we're going in with the United States. The United States is our ally. The United States isn't going to allow this to fail. And a lot of the people, commanders on the ground, were told. I mean, I know one guy who was a battalion leader. If Castro has jet planes, you'll have jet planes. If Castro has this, you'll have. Of course, the brigade didn't have jets, so it can only mean that we're here. We'll go in with you. And so there was always that. And then, just after midnight, on the 17th, the brigade starts landing. And there's a whole bunch of problems with that, but they were landing. And then 3 hours later, in Nicaragua, these Cuban pilots are all strapping in to their airplanes, warming the engines, filling fuel tanks, getting ready to carry out those last D-Day sorties. Mind you, they hadn't been to Cuba in 2 days. They weren't allowed, right? But this was going to be the final one. This is the one that wasn't canceled. Everything was fine. We know exactly where these planes are. We're going to get them. They're on the flight line. And then one of the trainers, the guys who were running it, the head people who were all American, taking cables from Washington. D-Day sorties canceled. Every flight canceled. The guy in charge said, wait. Let me go through this again. He went through it 3 times. The U.S. personnel in Nicaragua couldn't believe it. What was his last name? Gar Turgan or something. But then Reed Doster, who was one of the trainers, he had to run. Just drive very quickly to the flight line because these guys were about to leave, right? And stopped his Jeep in front of it and gave the universal signal to cut engine, slicing his throat. And then he had to go plane by plane and say, canceled. Well, are U.S. planes going to be set? No. And so these guys landed, and the guys on the ships who were landing were told, you're going to land under an umbrella of protection. Don't worry about it, right? The skies will be ours. And of course, you need that in any landing. And of course, they get there, they start landing. There's a few militia troops here and there, no problem. And then first thing in the morning, all of a sudden they see a B-26 come overhead with Cuban Air Force insignia, which was fine because the brigade's planes were painted with that also, sort of to fool enemy troops. And next thing you know, they start getting attacked by these planes. And Castro's planes went right after the ships. Most of the equipment, radio equipment, medical equipment, food, ammunition, most of it was still aboard these ships. And Castro went straight at the ships, right? On one front, he beached one, taking everything out of commission, plus a whole battalion. Off the main shore, he hit another ship, and that ship blew up into a mushroom cloud. And then all the other ships had to leave with most of the brigade. So you have 1,500 men, 1,400 men on the beach with about a day's worth of ammunition alone. And the ships were gone. They went to international waters with the intention of coming back, but they were never able to come back. And so you had these, 1,500 guys there for 3 days fighting with very little ammo, no food, very little water, expecting the whole time that, the United States had their backs. And they didn't. And on Tuesday, second day, U.S. jets flew right over them, dipped their wings in salute. They said, oh, finally, they're here. And they went across. Everybody was, getting all fired up again. Okay, they're here. They didn't abandon us. And then the planes flew right back over the water. They were only authorized to take pictures. Yeah, right. Good. And so these guys were just completely disillusioned. On the last day, as in the final moments, 2 U.S. destroyers showed up offshore. And it's like, thank God, okay, they're here. The Americans are here. And then the destroyers at this, they turned around and went right back. So you can understand the frustration level, but also, the great myth. This was a CIA plan. Kennedy was hands off. He trusted the CIA. He was so in awe of Richard Bissell and of Allen Dulles. They were legends, and he just, against his better judgment. And you will see serious documentaries about this, but read any book about it, and that's not what happened. The only thing Kennedy inherited was that there was a plan to invade Cuba. That's it. What he finally allowed to go was something completely. Now, I grew up in an environment where, I had friends whose fathers and uncles were part of those 1,400 men on the beach, right? And a community that just knows these people because they were, they're part of my community that I grew up in. And you always knew who they were. You always knew who the Bay of Pigs veterans were. And so, I wanted to show that. And I wrote a nonfiction book about it. And then I figured, I want to write something fictional about it. And so far, the guys that were there who've read the book have enjoyed it. So
I have to ask, out of general curiosity, these troops must have been decimated. Mm-hmm. Actually, decimated is the wrong use of the word because that means 10% of them. Right. I don't know, 10% of them. Did they 10% survive?
I mean, they fought. They were extremely well trained. Now, the brigade's B-26s were allowed to go to the beach after that. But again, when the brigade B-26s went to the beach. Again, they were supposed to operate from the beach, but the sky was to be theirs. Castro had fighter planes. You can't send B-26s against fighter planes. And those B-26s took out the rear guns to put in extra fuel. So what the B-26s were reduced to was flying sorties, leaving Nicaragua, flying to the Bay of Pigs. They had about a half an hour and would have to go back. That's if they made it, because they went to the Bay of Pigs, and there were Sea Furies there, armed T-33s, which are fast fighter planes. These are big B-26 bombers, so a lot of the pilots died. I mean, they went anyway, and they hit them as best they could.
What percent of the 1,500 men who...
Probably around 10%. I mean,
died.
Yeah, I mean, different battalions, etc. A lot died escaping, because as long as they could fight, the brigade pound for pound was much better trained and much more disciplined than Castro troops. Castro, just sent these militia units, out after them. And he really just threw people on the front lines right into the line of fire. So a lot more Castro people died than brigade people died. I mean, the attrition rate, if you base the victory based on that, Castro lost a lot more people, especially in one battle where the B-26s came in and there were no Castro planes anywhere. And on that, in that battle on April 17th, at around 2:30 or so in the afternoon, the destruction that the brigades B-26s did to Castro's troops was immense. You can imagine 22 B-26s 24 hours a day with no opposition aircraft having a field day. Those three roads would have been completely clogged. If two B-26s in less than a half an hour destroyed an entire battalion, right? And then both those pilots died, by the way, at that battle. One got shot down as he was leaving, and another one, his plane was shot up, and he was going back to Nicaragua, but it didn't make it. And in fact, they were crossing a transport plane from Nicaragua, which carried one of the chaplains. And this one pilot and his navigator made their confession over the radio, and then 5 minutes later died in the ocean. But imagine 22 B-26s, 24 hours a day, fully armed, because these ships carried everything from bombs, mechanics, spare parts, everything, none of which was able to land. But imagine, total air domination, absolutely free to bomb whenever and wherever they wanted. And there was only 3 roads that led to the beachhead, which were narrow causeways through a swamp. So, Castro's people couldn't even maneuver off-road. It would have been a very simple matter. But Castro having 8-10 airplanes, made all the difference in the world.
Would have been a different story altogether.
Completely.
You have this wonderful book that's now available for people to read called Freedom Betrayed,
right.
which, and you can understand where the title comes from
right.
now. And you can find out how this story ends, right?
You can find out how the story, for this family.
Not for the family, but how the Bay of Pigs invasion ends is captured in this new novel.
And a lot of the men, out of ammunition, when it was all over and they were backed up into the main town there, they were told break up, into guerrilla units and go into the swamp, which of course was impossible. But a lot of them tried to get away, and some of them spent days out in the swamp, just surviving, trying to get out. And Castro surrounded every road, every foot trail with militia, sent people through the woods, helicopters overhead. So a lot of these men went days without water, without food. Most of them were captured. And a lot of them actually got killed during that time because, they thought for sure they were going to be executed. And so sometimes they just surrendered because they were so dehydrated and hungry. And a lot of them hadn't eaten since they left Nicaragua on the 14th. So it was unfortunate. And Batista people were banned from the brigade and the front. I think 3 Batista people somehow made it into the brigade, which Castro made a big show of. But if you read, you asked about the Soviet Union or sympathizers thereof, you read about 10,000 screaming white Batistianos who made up the brigade. Well, 10,000 is wrong. They weren't all white, and none of them were Batistianos. In fact, the students in them there had been rabidly anti-Batista. All of that political front in Miami, the political leaders of the brigade, were all anti-Batista politicians previously, and some of whom had served in Castro's first government when it looked like it was going to be a democracy. The man who was supposed to be the president of Cuba after the invasion of that government in arms at the beach was Castro's first prime minister, right? So this whole thing of these were Batista people, the myth is that if you were anti-Castro, then you were a Batista person. And that's just not the case. It's not even close to being the case, but it's so simple. And people who want to believe it could follow it so easily that you just put it out there for 50-something years and people are going to believe it.
Victor, thank you so much for
You're
joining
welcome.
me today and keeping me somewhat current on something that happened a long time ago.
Yeah.
These sorts of things are always incredibly complex, and there are a million different ways to learn about it. And one way is to read this fictional novel.
That's
so,
right.
Freedom Betrayed, Victor Triay. I hope everybody will go out and tune in to Victor Triay the next time he comes on this radio show for more about Cuba. This is Anna Wasesha, president of Middlesex Community College, wishing you all a good day.